France, November 1944. The rain fell in sheets, cold, biting, turning the runway into a river of mud and oil. Inside the 354th Fighter Group's forward airstrip, laughter echoed through the corrugated metal hangar. They weren't laughing out of joy. They were laughing at Frank Delaney. He stood there, sleeves rolled up, cigarette hanging from his lip, staring at a P-51 Mustang that looked more like a corpse than an aircraft. One wing was torn, half the fuselage scorched. On the floor beside it sat a pile of twisted metal, parts ripped from a wrecked German Me-262 jet. "Frank, you finally lost it," one mechanic barked. "You're gonna bolt Nazi engines to an American bird?" another sneered. Delaney just smirked, running a greasy hand along the plane's battered cowling. "Not bolt, fellas. Breathe. I'm gonna make her breathe like they do." The other men shook their heads. The Luftwaffe's jet, the Me-262, was the stuff of nightmares. Sleek, fast, untouchable. While American fighters clawed at the sky, those German monsters flew past them like phantoms. Commanders told their crews the technology was beyond reach. The U.S. didn't have the fuel, the turbines, or the time. But Frank Delaney wasn't listening. He never did. He'd been a mechanic long before the war, fixing trucks, race cars, and tractors on the frozen plains outside Chicago. He didn't see engines as machines. He saw them as creatures, living things that breathed air and fire. And when he looked at that wrecked Me-262 turbine, something in his mind clicked, a whisper of impossible math, the kind only a tinkerer could believe. "You try that," his sergeant said. "And the damn thing's gonna explode before it leaves the ground." Delaney grinned. "Then I'll just make sure it explodes forward." By midnight, the hangar was empty, except for him. Wires, oil drums, wrenches, and German scrap lay scattered across the floor. In the silence, the storm outside thrashed against the tin roof, while sparks from his welder danced like fireflies. No orders, no permission, no manuals. Just one man, and the stubborn idea that the impossible was simply something no one had bothered to try yet. A month later, in combat, Frank Delaney's junkyard jet would scream past 3 German fighters and hit 720 miles per hour. That night, though, it was just thunder, laughter, and a mad mechanic who refused to stop listening to the sky. By late 1944, the war in the air had split in two. On one side were the jets, Germany's Me-262s, sleek and silver, powered by engines that looked and sounded like the future. They screamed across the sky faster than anything mankind had built before. Pilots called them ghosts with guns. On the other side were the props, piston-driven workhorses like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang, reliable, rugged, but old. They were the past holding on with raw muscle, and every Allied mechanic knew the truth. They were running out of time. Reports poured in from the front. Bomber formations shredded by Me-262s before escorts could even climb to altitude. Intelligence briefings whispered one word over and over: unbeatable. In London, engineers at Rolls-Royce and Allison were experimenting with jet turbines under strict secrecy. But those designs were months, maybe years, from being combat-ready. The bureaucrats were cautious. The war was not. Command manuals declared, "No field modifications to power plants without authorization." In other words, don't even think about innovation. But on a muddy airfield in France, Frank Delaney was already breaking that rule. To most officers, the Me-262 represented a scientific miracle, something the Allies couldn't match. But to Delaney, it was just another engine, a creature with lungs and veins like any other. He studied wrecked German turbines the way a hunter studies an animal he's about to track. He saw opportunity where others saw mystery. "The Germans made it too delicate," he said once, wiping grease from his hands. "They built perfection that can't survive dirt. Ours just needs to run." While the rest of the squadron focused on repairs, Delaney spent nights sketching airflow diagrams on the hangar walls with charcoal. He scavenged aluminum tubing from crashed bombers, experimented with oil pressure valves, even ran tests on fuel mixtures behind his sergeant's back. The idea was madness, to blend a jet's exhaust principle with a piston engine's raw torque. It wasn't science. It was instinct. Other mechanics called him the junkyard prophet. Officers called him a liability. But Delaney didn't care. He'd already seen the writing on the sky. Whoever controlled speed would control the war, and he wasn't about to let the Germans keep it to themselves. One stormy night, as his fellow mechanics mocked him from their bunks, Frank whispered into the darkness, "If I can't build a jet, I'll fake one." In that moment, the divide between jets and props wasn't a technological gap. It was a challenge, and Frank Delaney had just accepted it. Before he was a war mechanic, Frank Delaney was a kid from Chicago's South Side who grew up breaking every rule about machines. His father ran a repair shop off 63rd Street, fixing trucks for bootleggers and tractors for farmers who'd come into town. Frank wasn't supposed to touch the tools, but by age 10, he'd rebuilt his first carburetor. By 15, he'd dropped out of school to work full-time, earning a reputation as the only kid who could make a busted Ford engine purr again using nothing but fence wire and a hammer. When the Depression hit, Frank kept the shop alive by racing cars on frozen lakes to win prize money. His car, a rusted 1932 Ford, had no muffler, no brakes, and a supercharger made from scrap exhaust pipes. He didn't care. What mattered to him wasn't perfection. It was performance. He always said, "Engines are like people. Some choke on pressure. Some live for it." When war came, he enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces. Not to fly, but to fix. He was stationed with the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustangs, in England, where pilots trained for daylight bomber escort. He arrived with a duffel bag of tools and a smirk, already infamous for bending regulations. Within weeks, officers noticed. He modified spark plugs to boost thrust during cold starts. He rerouted cooling ducts to reduce drag by 1%, a miracle considering he used tin cans and radiator scraps to do it. When reprimanded, he'd just shrug and say, "The book wasn't written for dirt." But it wasn't until he arrived in France after D-Day that his genius turned into defiance. The frontline airstrips were hell, mud, cold, chaos. Mechanics worked knee-deep in sludge, patching bullet holes with duct tape and prayer. Spare parts were rare. Aircraft that couldn't be repaired were cannibalized for parts. That's where Frank thrived, among the wrecks, where creativity was the only currency that mattered. He slept beside engines, memorizing every vibration, every cough, every shift in tone. When a pilot complained about fuel starvation mid-flight, Frank would listen to the idle for 10 seconds and diagnose the issue on sound alone. The men started calling him the engine whisperer. But his curiosity was what worried command. He didn't just fix things, he changed them. He was fascinated by the wrecked Me-262 jet turbines scattered across captured German airfields. The sound, the burn pattern, the thrust line, everything about them whispered to him like forbidden knowledge. The Germans had used science to make their jets soar. Frank Delaney was about to use instinct to make one fly higher than any of them ever dreamed. And he'd do it not in a lab, but in a muddy hangar, armed with nothing but stolen tools and a mind too stubborn to quit. By December 1944, the numbers told a grim truth, and Frank Delaney knew them better than anyone. The Me-262 could hit 540 miles per hour. The P-51 Mustang, America's fastest piston fighter, topped out around 437. That 100-mile gap wasn't a difference, it was a death sentence. The Luftwaffe's jet pilots could dive, shoot, and vanish before American gunners could even line up a shot. Bomber crews called them gray ghosts. Escort squadrons called them unreachable. And yet, on the ground, the problem wasn't just speed, it was supply. For every one Me-262 Germany built, America rolled out 5 P-51s. But production wasn't the same as performance. What good was mass when your engines froze at high altitude or your fuel lines cracked under pressure? Frank had seen it all. Out of 100 P-51s arriving from England that month, at least 30 were grounded due to engine seizures or oil starvation. Each malfunction meant another bomber squadron flying unescorted, another dozen crews lost in the cold blue void over the Ruhr. And fuel was the real enemy. The high-octane 100,130 grade aviation fuel that gave the Mustang its speed was stretched thin across Europe. The new rich mix additive being tested in England boosted performance but overheated engines within hours. It was shelved, officially banned from use outside of controlled trials. Frank had read the report. He'd even seen the fuel drums sitting unused behind the depot, marked with red stencils. Experimental. Do not issue. To a man like him, that was a challenge carved in capital letters. He started running his own calculations. What if he could cool the airflow just enough to balance the detonation? What if the higher burn rate could be offset by a richer oil mixture? To command, it was chemistry. To Frank, it was rhythm. Air, pressure, heat, flow. Like tuning an instrument. He scribbled the math on a ration box, wrote beside it, "If we can't catch their jets, we make ours run like one." By early January, the casualty reports came in. Over 180 Allied bombers lost in a single week to jet attacks. Escort squadrons reported interception rates under 30%. Luftwaffe aces like Galland and Barkhorn were racking up kills faster than ever before. But Frank wasn't staring at the numbers in fear. He was staring at a thermometer jammed into an engine block, watching it flirt with the red line, muttering to himself, "If it burns hotter, it flies harder." Command saw danger. He saw possibility. And in the quiet math of madness, he was about to turn danger into velocity. It began with a whisper in the hangar. Someone said Frank Delaney was cooking jet fuel. They weren't entirely wrong. The night was cold enough to freeze oil into sludge. The 354th's flight line glowed faintly under the moon, exhaust trails steaming from idling Mustangs. Frank stood in the corner, sleeves rolled up, staring at two fuel drums, one marked 100,130 avgas, the other in bold red paint. Experimental, 150 grade, handle with care. That second drum wasn't supposed to be here. It had been condemned weeks ago after a test plane in England nearly blew a cylinder through its cowling. But Frank had convinced a truck driver to accidentally offload it during a refueling run. He popped the lid, took one breath, and grinned. "Smells like trouble, the good kind." Using a piece of chalk, he sketched ratios directly on the hangar floor. 70% standard fuel, 30% of the hot mix. Then he added a secret third ingredient, coolant oil scavenged from a wrecked P-47 Thunderbolt, thick as syrup, which he claimed would keep her lungs cool while she screamed. To anyone else, it looked like insanity. To Frank, it was harmony, fire and oil in balance. He funneled the mixture carefully into the Mustang's tank, humming as he worked. His assistant, Corporal Jenkins, watched in disbelief. "Sir, that'll fry the pistons." Frank smirked. "Then we'll have ourselves a faster fryer." The next morning, under a pale gray sky, he found his volunteer, a reckless 24-year-old pilot named Eddie Marlowe, known for buzzing his own airfield just to prove a point. Frank handed him a clipboard. "You want to see how fast freedom burns?" Eddie chuckled. "Hell, if it explodes, at least we'll go out first place." The engine roared to life, and it didn't sound like any Merlin before it. The pitch was deeper, angrier, alive. The ground shook. The air shimmered behind the exhaust stacks like heat off asphalt. "Throttle to 60%, Frank shouted. Eddie pushed the lever. The plane lurched forward. Instruments redlined. The manifold pressure hit 75 inches of mercury, a reading that should have torn the cylinders apart. Instead, the plane held. The sound rose to a scream. Frank's eyes widened. "It's breathing!" Eddie took off. Within seconds, the P-51 was a silver streak against the dawn. The altimeter climbed, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 feet. Then, radio chatter crackled. "This can't be right. I'm still climbing. I'm passing 30. The tower went silent. Then a second voice broke in. "What's your airspeed?" "I don't know. The dial's pegged." For 2 minutes, the Mustang screamed across the sky faster than any piston fighter had ever flown. Then, as quickly as it came, the power dropped. Eddie leveled out, gliding back to base, smoke trailing faintly from the cowling. When he landed, Frank sprinted out, eyes wild. Eddie stumbled down, grinning, face pale from the G's. "You're out of your damn mind, Delaney." "But that bird just hit 720 miles an hour in a dive." Silence fell. Mechanics gawked. One whispered, "That's jet speed." Frank just patted the Mustang's hot nose and said, "Guess she forgot she wasn't one." By that night, word had spread across the squadron. The mad mechanics' banned fuel had done the impossible. But Frank knew what was coming. Success that loud doesn't stay secret long. And when command found out, they wouldn't be laughing. By the next morning, Frank Delaney's hangar was surrounded, not by enemy bombers, but by disbelief. Pilots, crew chiefs, and even a colonel from Group HQ crowded around the battered P-51, still ticking with heat. The air smelled like burned oil and victory. Frank stood there, arms crossed, a cigarette in one hand and a slide rule in the other. His grin said everything. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" the colonel barked. Frank shrugged. Gave her lungs she didn't know she had. But beneath the swagger, Frank's mind was already racing through the math of the miracle. The numbers didn't add up, and yet they did. The mix he'd made had increased manifold pressure by nearly 40%, but the coolant oil he'd blended into the line had kept the cylinder temperature under 260 degrees, just shy of detonation. By normal engineering logic, it shouldn't have worked. By his logic, it couldn't have failed. It was the balance of chaos. Burn hotter, but breathe cooler. When Eddie Marlowe had hit 720 km/h in a dive, it wasn't just speed, it was aerodynamic heresy. At that velocity, the air itself becomes an enemy. Compressibility, the silent killer of propeller aircraft, should have locked his controls, shattered his wings. But Frank's cooling mix had an unintentional side effect. By changing the exhaust pressure, he had shifted the center of gravity in the airflow pattern, reducing compressibility drag by 12%. He hadn't just built a faster Mustang. He'd built one that could survive speeds no piston fighter was ever meant to reach. "Maybe it wasn't an accident," he said later. "Maybe the plane just needed someone to let it breathe wrong." When the test data was logged, engineers back in England dismissed it as instrument error. 720 mpr was jet territory, a physical impossibility for a prop-driven plane. But every man on that field had seen it. The contrails, the blurred silver streak, the scream that didn't sound human. Word spread fast. Other squadrons began whispering about the Delaney mix. Mechanics tried to replicate it. Most failed. A few nearly blew their engines apart. Only Frank's touch, his uncanny instinct for how much was too much, kept it from crossing into disaster. He wasn't just playing with combustion. He was dancing on the edge of physics itself. One pilot summed it up best in a letter home. "He's not a mechanic. He's some kind of mad conductor, and his orchestra is made of explosions." That week, his modified Mustang flew 3 escort missions, and on each one it outclimbed the Germans' Me-262s before they could even line up a shot. The Luftwaffe pilots were stunned. Reports claimed, "American aircraft exhibiting jet-like acceleration." Frank didn't care about the headlines. He was already back in the hangar, sleeves rolled up, muttering to himself about airflow harmonics and fuel that sings. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing perfection through chaos. And for a brief, impossible moment, he'd caught it. January 14th, 1945. Over Western Germany. Clouds at 25,000 feet. the air thin and cruel. Captain Eddie Marlowe was flying Frank Delaney's rebuilt P-51, the Franken 51, as the pilots jokingly called it, leading a bomber escort for the 8th Air Force. Below him, 400 flying fortresses droned east toward their target, a ball-bearing plant near Kassel. At 27,000 feet, radar picks up something fast, metallic, and closing. Then the shout over the radio, "Bandits, jet contacts, 12 o'clock high!" Marlowe's oxygen mask fogged as he tightened his gloves. He knew what that meant. Me-262s, the unstoppable predators of the sky. They usually dove through bomber formations, struck like lightning, and vanished before any Mustang could climb to meet them. But today wasn't usual. He shoved the throttle forward and felt the kick. The band mix ignited with a growl that shook the cockpit. The Merlin engine didn't roar. It screamed. The Mustang surged upward at a climb rate no prop plane had ever known, climbing 3,000 feet in seconds. Below, the bomber crews stared in disbelief as a silver streak rocketed past them. "Is that a jet?" one gunner yelled. "No, it's one of ours." At 30,000 feet, the Me-262s appeared, sleek, deadly, banking into their attack run. Eddie cut across their line, forcing them to break formation. The German leader radioed in confusion. "Impossible! Propeller aircraft closing from below." He was already within 800 yards. Eddie thumbed the trigger. 6 50-caliber guns erupted. One jet took a hit in the wing root. Fire, smoke, disintegration. The other two tried to roll away, but Eddie was faster. Not by luck. By physics. The altered airflow from Frank's modifications gave the plane a sharper throttle response, the RPM curve peaking faster. The Mustang could sprint. "Coming around!" Eddie shouted, pulling 5 Gs into a dive. Below, tracer lines crossed the gray sky like fiery threads. He locked on another Me-262 just as it tried to run. The Mustang closed the gap, 700 mph in a shallow dive. Both planes trembled, both on the edge of aerodynamic collapse. Eddie fired again. The jet's canopy exploded in a burst of flame and metal. 2 kills in 30 seconds. "Holy hell," one bomber crewman radioed. "That Mustang just outran a jet." When Eddie landed back at base, his hands were shaking. The crew swarmed him before the propeller even stopped spinning. "How the hell did you do it?" someone yelled. Eddie just laughed. "Ask the madman in the hangar." Hours later, Frank Delaney was called before the group commander. He was expecting handcuffs. Instead, the colonel just stared at him, silent, before saying, "You made history up there, and you know damn well I can't let you do it again." The Franken 51 was grounded for safety review. Frank didn't argue. He knew what it meant. Bureaucracy catching up to genius. But deep down, both men understood something. For that brief, blazing moment, a homemade jet, built by a mechanic with no blueprints, no orders, no permission, had done the impossible. The Mustang had leapt into the future, and the Luftwaffe had seen it with their own terrified eyes. The age of the jet had arrived, but the first one to prove it didn't come from a lab. It came from a muddy hangar and a man who refused to obey physics. The next morning, the hangar felt like a crime scene. The Franken 51 sat in silence, engine still warm, the scent of burned fuel hanging thick in the air. Mechanics whispered while 2 officers from 8 Fighter Command circled the plane with clipboards and hard faces. Frank Delaney watched from the doorway, a wrench in one hand and a cigarette in the other. He wasn't nervous, just tired. He'd known this was coming. You don't defy engineering doctrine and hit jet speeds without making enemies. Colonel McKenna, the man sent to contain the miracle, finally spoke. "Sergeant Delaney, I have a report here that says your aircraft exceeded 700 miles per hour." Frank exhaled smoke. "Report's wrong. It was 720. The colonel didn't smile. He flipped a page. "You violated engine mixing protocols, bypassed the carburetor safety system, and used banned fuel components." Frank shrugged. "And it worked." Silence. Then the colonel leaned in, voice low. "You're lucky this isn't a court-martial. But I've got scientists in London who'd sell their souls to know how you did it." For the next 3 hours, the investigation turned into an interrogation. They questioned ratios, temperatures, flow pressures. Frank tried to explain. Not in equations, but in rhythm. He talked about letting the engine breathe, about the sound of combustion, about balancing heat with harmony. One engineer muttered, "He talks like a poet, not a mechanic." Frank smirked. "Guess your physics never learned to listen." When they tore the Mustang's engine apart, the findings were baffling. The cylinder heads showed zero signs of detonation. Oil viscosity had increased under temperature instead of thinning. The airflow manifold had warped, but evenly, almost symmetrically, reducing drag. By every conventional metric, it shouldn't have survived. But it had. And it had flown like nothing on Earth. Back in London, the Air Ministry lab duplicated the experiment. Their engines blew up in under a minute. One frustrated technician wrote in his log, "It wasn't chemistry, it was instinct. And we can't replicate instinct." Meanwhile, Frank was grounded, officially pending reassignment. Unofficially, command didn't want him near another aircraft until the war ended. Too unpredictable, too dangerous, too effective. But even that couldn't bury his legend. Pilots who'd seen the Franken 51 in action started spreading stories. They claimed it accelerated like a meteor, that its exhaust shimmered blue, that it could climb straight into the sun. The Germans, too, noticed. A captured Luftwaffe report described a piston aircraft of unusual velocity. Presumed prototype. Frank never saw that report. He spent the next few weeks fixing engines, pretending to follow the rules, pretending he didn't care. But sometimes, late at night, when the others were asleep, he'd walk into the hangar, put his hand on the cowling of that grounded P-51, and whisper, "You and me, sweetheart. We flew faster than they ever dreamed." It wasn't defiance anymore. It was love. The kind only a man who lived his life inside engines could understand. He hadn't just built a machine. He'd set it free. And even if the brass locked it down, they couldn't change the truth. For one glorious moment in the winter of 1945, a mechanic's madness had outrun science itself. When the war ended in 1945, Europe celebrated. But in one forgotten airfield outside Reims, a single mechanic packed up his tools in silence. Frank Delaney didn't get medals. He didn't even get his final paycheck on time. His name never appeared in a single engineering report or squadron citation. His illegal fuel experiment had been erased from official record, buried under red stamps and thick black lines. But legends don't need paper. They just need people who saw it happen. Pilots who flew with him told the story everywhere they went, in pubs, in briefings, in the long, quiet flights home over the Atlantic. They called it the junkyard jet, a P-51 that could outrun a Me-262. A plane powered not by regulation, but by instinct, guts, and a little insanity. And in those retellings, Frank Delaney became something bigger than a man. He became the embodiment of a truth the U.S. war machine had learned the hard way. That genius doesn't always wear a lab coat. Sometimes it wears a grease-stained jacket and curses at the wind. Years later, when Air Force engineers were designing early turbojet engines, they came across archived fuel test data from the European theater. One entry, anonymous, dated January 1945, showed an impossible ratio of fuel, oil, and air pressure. It shouldn't have existed. The footnote read simply, "Unknown field modification, performance unverified." But among the men who understood, whispers spread. Delaney's mix. The crazy one who made a jet out of a Mustang. And perhaps that's how he would have wanted it. Not credit, not fame, just the quiet knowledge that he'd done what everyone said couldn't be done. After the war, Frank returned to Chicago, opened a small repair shop near Midway Airport, fixed trucks, built hot rods, laughed at new mechanics who quoted manuals like scripture. His tools never gleamed, but his engines always purred. When the first generation of American jet fighters, the P-80 Shooting Star, rolled out in '46, a friend sent him a photo. The note read, "You were just a year too early." He taped it above his workbench and never said a word. Neighbors would sometimes hear him late at night, tuning an engine, humming the same rhythm he'd used to balance that band mix years ago. The sound was steady, calm, until he throttled it. Then the growl returned. That same deep, furious tone that once shattered the skies over Germany. And in that small garage, for a fleeting second, it almost sounded like the Frank 51 was flying again. Men like Delaney didn't build legacies. They built echoes. Echoes that became doctrines. Instincts that became innovation. The U.S. would go on to rule the skies with machines faster, sleeker, and deadlier than anything before. But the soul of all of them, the daring, the madness, the refusal to obey limits, came from men like him. Because before America built jets, one man with a wrench had already turned imagination into thrust. Decades later, a young Air Force cadet walked through the archives at Wright-Patterson Air Base, rows upon rows of dust, data, and forgotten brilliance. In a file labeled Field Modifications, European Theater, 1944 to 45, he found a single yellowing report, typed on a Remington with smudged ink. Unverified performance claim, P-51D fighter, achieved estimated airspeed of 720 mph. Compressibility threshold exceeded. Pilot, Captain E. Marlowe. Mechanic, Sergeant F. Delaney. Notes: unauthorized configuration. Replication failed. The cadet smiled. Failed, he whispered, because it was human. That's what Frank Delaney had always understood, long before jet turbines or radar domes or computers. Machines were just reflections of the men who built them, and sometimes those men had to break every rule in the book to show the world what was possible. Frank never knew that his experiment would outlive him. When the Air Force began designing the F-86 Sabre in the late '40s, engineers faced the same problem: heat, pressure, drag. And buried in the data that informed the Sabre's breakthrough cooling systems was a familiar phrase: enhanced thermal balance through mixed-fuel cooling. His madness had become math. His instinct had become law. But Frank wouldn't have cared about any of that. He once said, "If it runs, it flies. If it flies, it's free." That was his gospel. In the quiet fields of Illinois, where he spent his final years, you could still hear that gospel humming. The locals said every Sunday morning, just before sunrise, the old mechanic would roll out a vintage Mustang fuselage he'd been restoring for years. He'd sit in the cockpit, hand on the throttle, and whisper, "Let's see if the sky remembers us." He never took off. Not again. But maybe he didn't have to. Because for one impossible moment in a freezing hangar in 1945, he'd already done what no engineer, no pilot, no scientist had dared to try. He'd taken a machine meant for limits and made it believe in freedom. The men who laughed at him learned that day that madness isn't the absence of reason. It's the pursuit of truth no one else can see. And somewhere above the clouds where piston and jet first met, you can almost hear it still, a roar that shouldn't exist, a streak of silver that breaks every rule of physics, and the ghost of a Mustang that once flew like lightning itself. Because Frank Delaney didn't build an aircraft. He built a rebellion that could fly.